There is no homosexuality in the Quran. Assalamu alaikum. What I just said, I know it's shocking. You will point out to me and say, the people of Lut, the Rasul Lut in the Quran, they were doing homosexuality. And that is why they got the punishment. And that I don't know anything about the Quran. Well, I will say, let's look at what the Quran says about this topic. Before we begin, let me read out the Quran to you. تلك آيات الله نتلوها عليك بالحق فبأي حديث بعد الله وآياته يؤمنون. Those are the verses, signs of Allah, which we present to you in with truth. Then in what statement after Allah and His ayat will they believe? فبأي حديث بعد الله وآياته يؤمنون. They say Lut's qawm engaged in homosexuality, that they lusted for Lut's pretty male guests, that they couldn't control their hormones. And when they did that, Lut, a messenger of Allah, he offered his own daughters to those homosexuals to protect his guests. They also continue to argue that the Quran's Lut is the same lot of the Bible. And they would say, let's use the Jewish Israeliyat and the fake stories and riwayat and all those storybooks and fiction works that we've got to understand the Quran. Let's not understand the Quran's Lut just through itself, but let's supplement that with all this other literature we've got, because they're talking about the same person. And they will say, as you will say if you haven't pondered the story of Lut in the Quran, that Allah punished the qawm of Lut because they committed sodomy, homosexuality, that there were males who were doing sexual acts between each other. Did Allah say that? Does the Quran really mention sodomy? Does it? Let's be honest. Have you wondered why there's no rain of stones for homosexuals today? Did Allah's Sunnah change suddenly? He used to punish these people before in the long gone past, but now He doesn't see what's happening in Los Angeles or Berlin or Sydney. All of those clubs, all of those cultures thriving in homosexuals, nothing happens to them. There's no rain of stone for them. Why? And by the way, did you also ever question, did Allah actually order us, you, me, I, our leaders, to be punishing homosexuals because of what they do by killing them? Did Allah say that we have to throw these homosexuals off high buildings? That we have to burn them alive? That they should be stoned to death by you, by me, by us? Did He actually say that? Before we continue, let me ask you a couple of questions. Is Allah's kalam enough for you? Are you ready to listen to the Quran? Will you let the Quran guide your thinking? I will come back to this question. Is Allah's kalam enough for you? If it is, continue watching. If it's not, maybe this is the time to stop. أَفَغَيْرَ اللَّهِ أَبْتَغِي حَكَمًا وَهُوَ الَّذِي أَنزَلَ إِلَيْكُمُ الْكِتَابَ مُفَصَّلًا. Then is it other than Allah I should seek as a judge, while it is He who has revealed to you all the Al-Kitab explained in detail. أَنزَلَ إِلَيْكُمْ الْكِتَابَ مُفَصَّلًا. He has revealed to you all the Al-Kitab explained in detail. والذين آتيناهم الكتاب يعلمون أنه منزل من ربك بالحق فلا تكونن من الممترين. And to those whom we have given the Al-Kitab, know that it is sent down from your Lord in with truth. So never be among the doubters. I'd like to make a few points before we start looking into the ayahs of the Quran. This is video 2 of the series Lut in the Quran. In the first video, we looked at all of the scenes in the story of Rasul Lut and what happens scene by scene by scene. And what we discovered in there was very surprising, because ultimately what we found was that the story of Lut, the beats of what happens to him and his people, that is completely different in the Quran compared to what we were taught based on the Israeliyat and the riwayat that had nothing to do with the Quran. This video does stand on its own. But if you are interested in finding the other references, then I encourage you to go back and watch the first video in which we looked at the whole story from the beginning up until the end. This series and this video is not an attempt to legitimize the LGBTQ movement. I should not be talking about my personal feelings when I'm talking about the Quran, but because it's such a sensitive topic, I want to be clear. I want to make my position transparent in front of those who would be watching this and possibly trying to critique it afterwards. Personally, this research of the Quran, find the idea of a man with a man repulsive. I also object to the rapid encroachment of this LGBTQ agenda that is all around us, and especially as a parent. However, I have made an attempt, a deliberate attempt, as much as is possible for me as a human, to not let my biases control what I present from the Quran. Just because I don't like something or I personally don't approve of something does not mean that I should be able to go and seed it into the Quran, putting words into a source when it does not say that. Also, a point on the methodology. We let the Quran speak. No matter what you, I, we, whatever we find yuck, whatever is wrong, whatever feels icky to us, we don't let that control what the Quran says. Whatever our preconceived starting notions might be, our positions might be, our biases might be, our predilections might lead us to, we try and not let them override what the message of the source, i.e. the Quran, is. As you will see in this video as well, just like the video number 1 of this series, we will be presenting propositions. Those propositions will be supported by the Quranic ayat, and those ayat are what forms the falsifiability criteria for whatever I'm going to be talking about. Why am I saying this? If you don't like what I'm presenting from the Quran, you can prove me wrong. You can critique me by looking at the source, which is the same source that you and I both share, which is the ayat of the Quran. It's as simple as that. Now, let's consult the Quran with an open mind, and let's let the Quran guide our understanding. It's a very fair ask. Right, for those who watched the first video, you will know which file you're looking at. This file, for those who are watching it now, or as a refresher for those who watched it last week, is the beat-by-beat narrative of what happens to Lut in the Quran across 15 surahs. So 15 surahs in which the story of Lut appears. What I've tried to do in here is to map it out in a sequential manner. We went through the structure in great detail in the first video. Just to set the scene of where today's talk will sit, I will quickly squiz through the file just to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of where do this famous homosexuality verses sit in the overall context of the story of Lut. So in this file, again, by the way, for those who are going to be struggling to look at this screen, you will have to zoom in if you are on a mobile phone. Even if you're on a desktop, you probably will have to zoom. There's nothing more. There's nothing I can do about this factor. And it is just not possible to show all of this in the same screen, in a small screen. So I'll start scrolling now. In the beginning are some overall remarks, observations of the Quran regarding Lut and his people. If we scroll down, we looked at the relationship that Lut had with Ibrahim. And then is the first of 2 scenes in which this so-called homosexuality incident happens, or the talk is about homosexuality, or as it is alleged. So in the last video we did not cover these ayat. Today we will be covering these ayat to see actually what is happening in here. So the context in here is that whilst Rasul Lut and Nabi Ibrahim are engaged in conversations and communications and are trading all sorts of tips and guidance mechanisms between their people, Lut enjoys a position of an akh in his community. And as an akh, for the first time the Quran records him talking to his people about them doing something which was not good. Now, what is that something? You and I traditionally have known that to be homosexuality. Is it really the case? We're going to find out. If we continue on with the story, we have got the daif, the guests that go to Nabi Ibrahim for the first time. That's right, if you haven't seen the video number 1, there are at least 2 separate visits that Nabi Ibrahim gets from these Mursaleen. After that, the Mursaleen, they come to Al-Lut, not Ahl-Lut. There's a difference between the two. What is the difference? We covered this in the last video. And then after that particular scene is the incident where Lut now talks to his people a second time. And in this talk, there's this talk about you are approaching the rijal shahwatan. And this is taken to mean that these people have now become homosexuals. So these are those very famous ayat, in addition to the one we just saw up above, on the basis of which is said that Lut's people engaged in homosexuality, and then whatever happened to them after that was a result, direct result, of what happens in these conversations. We are going to be looking at every single word of these 3 sections as well. If we continue on with the story, Lut was saved, as we talked about it. Rasul Lut asked for his Ahl then to be saved, but he didn't quite know the difference between his own Ahl and his own Al. He didn't know who really was a part of his Ahl. Nor did the Mursaleen, which is quite an interesting little discovery we made when we talked about this story in the first video of the series. Then hostilities broke out between the people. The side of Lut versus the Ahl al-Madinah. They come out and they were celebrating, and that is something we talked about last time. But what we did not talk about was something very interesting, in which Lut allegedly offered his Banat, translated as his daughters, to those people in order to satiate their need for homosexual sex with those really pretty men who have visited Rasul Lut. So in other words, what is being said is, by the traditional translations, that in this particular section, when the guests have come to Rasul Lut, these are very handsome, pretty men. And when the people of the area look at them, they can't control themselves. They must have these young men. And now they come and they're happy. They're celebrating already that they're going to be having a feast with these men. And this is when Lut comes up to them and says, "Don't do this to my guests. You are going to make me humiliated. Instead, here are my daughters. Take my daughters. Do what you want to do with my daughters, but leave my guests." This is what's alleged. We're going to talk about that particular section as well, because, well, we'll let the Quran speak about what the Banat here actually means. By the way, this is the first time in which Lut offers his Banat to these people. As we have seen elsewhere in the Qissa, there were 2 times that Lut offered his Banat to these people. This here is the first time, which we're going to talk about. Now, once this incident happens, there's a second visit of the Rasul to Nabi Ibrahim. Again, what happens is a very interesting conversation that we talked about last time. But once that second visit has happened, and they visit Rasul Lut this time around again, something has changed. Something has changed significantly. And it is at that time that for the second and the final time, Rasul Lut once more offers his Banat to his people. And once more he is rejected. So no, he's not yet again offering his daughters to those people who must have those men who were his guests. But there's something completely different happening out there. And as I said, we're going to be talking about that today. What happens with the rest of the story? I will let you, if you're interested, go and watch the first video of the series. For now, as I said, we're going to flick over to my other screen, where we're going to look at all of these very interesting sections that they said explicitly talk about homosexuality. Do they? Let's have a look. Okay, so this is today's final word file. And in this one, luckily for all of us, for you and for me, I will be zooming in so we can see things clearer. Now, for those who didn't see it, here in this section, I have broken up the entire scene-by-scene story into great detail. So we have not only done the mafhum and the translation of some very key ayat in here, but based upon that, we derived a lot of propositions to try and get an academic understanding of what was happening and what that implied for Lut, for his people, and also for those around them. Also, as we were talking about these very interesting ideas, we took a few comments and we discussed them, any observations that were pertinent, or even on the tertiary that kind of completed the story, we talked about them as well. So I'm going to remind you real quickly of how we get to the first scene, and then we'll look at the scene in detail. So in the beginning, as I said, are some general observations of the Quran about Rasul Lut and his people. So now if we continue, we come to the part which establishes the relationship between Rasul Lut and Nabi Ibrahim. And after that, whilst Rasul Lut is an akh in his community, he has his first conversation with his people that we have been told is all about sex and homosexuality. That these men were all about chasing other men for homosexual desires, and Lut was saying, don't do it, stop it. Let's start from that first section. We will look at Ayat 161 to 169 of chapter 26. So remember, this is the first time the Quran is recording something that Lut is saying to his qawm as an akh. This is how the conversation happens. إِذْ قَالَ لَهُمْ أَخُوهُمْ لُوط أَلَا تَتَّقُونَ. When Lut, their fellow brother, one they had relied on, said to them, qawm, which is males and females, why don't you stay away from that which is prohibited in Allah's system? Have taqwa. Inni lakum rasulun amin. Surely I am to you, males and females, a trustworthy messenger. Fattaqullah wa ati'uni. Then develop Allah consciousness and obey me. وَمَا أَسْأَلُكُمْ عَلَيْهِ مِنْ أَجْرٍ إِنْ أَجْرِيَ إِلَّا عَلَى رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. And I do not ask you all, males and females, any reward for this. My reward is only with the nourisher of all the realms of knowledge. أَتَأْتُونَ الذُّكْرَانَ مِنَ الْعَالَمِينَ. Do you, males and females, take the reminder, teaching, instruction from the communities around you? وَتَذَرُونَ مَا خَلَقَ لَكُمْ رَبُّكُمْ مِنْ أَزْوَاجِكُمْ بَلْ أَنْتُمْ قَوْمٌ عَادُونَ. And instead, you, males and females, leave what your nourisher created from your own azwaj, partners. No, you're, males and females, you are surely a people hostile against that which is right. قَالُوا لَإِن لَمْ تَنْتَهِي يَا لُوطُ لَتَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْمُخْرَجِينَ. They, males and females, said, surely if you don't stop this, O Lut, surely you will be among those who are kicked out. قَالْ إِنِّي لَعَمَلِكُمْ مِنَ الْقَالِينَ. He said, surely I detest your males and females' action. That is the conversation that happens between Lut and his people, whilst he has got a different status, that of an akh. So we're going to talk about everything in great detail, but we'll do this in a proper order. So let me come on the left hand side and we'll start with this. So as I said, he was an akh at this part in his community. When he reasoned with his community, he did so from a position of power. And also what's quite interesting is that his community has not yet deteriorated to the level of a qarya. He is still talking to people of a Medina. However, Lut is warned in here. So now, based upon the Quranic ayat, which is the source material, and the mafhum of these Quranic ayat, which we have captured here word by word, we are going to talk about some of the key propositions that we are able to establish based upon our source. So just a reminder, if you wish to critique, really, here is your falsifiability criteria. These are the ayat. This is the mafhum of them. Here is everything you need to critique anything that's being talked about in this particular video. So in this video, we're going to talk about the propositions that relate to this section, the so-called homosexuality verses. And these are the ones that we did not cover last time. So let's begin with this proposition. Rasul Lut was already warning his qawm before the Rasul came to him on 2 occasions. As I said before, this is a very likely proposition. 21. Rasul Lut enjoyed a position of relative authority in his society where he could remind his qawm as an akh, one of the powerful ones, one that was depended upon. Very likely, considering the tone of the conversation. 22. Rasul Lut warned his qawm that comprised men and women. This is certain. Qawm does not just mean men. It's almost a tautology. A nation is made up of men and women. A community is made up of men and women. A qawm in the Quran is not just men. When Lut is talking to his qawm, to his people, he's talking to men and women. It is an absolute certainty throughout the Quran and in this particular story as well. 23. Rasul of Allah do not ask for reward. Their reward is with Allah. 24. Ityan in the Quran has got no connection with sex of any kind. It is certain, and I'll talk about this more when we come to the right hand side. 25. Al-Zukran is the reminder, instruction that the people of Lut sought from those around them. Certain, and we're going to talk about this on the right hand side as well. Other aqwam around Qawm Lut were also involved in corrupt ideologies. Certain, because there are always good and corrupt societies in the world. 27. Just like Rasul Lut and Nabi Ibrahim knew each other, the corrupt segments of different peoples also interacted with each other. 28. Azwaj in the Quran are associates, partners who help complement a mission. Now this might come as a surprise to quite a few people, but this is something that's absolutely clear. Quran does not talk about Nabi's wives in the Quran, for example. There's nothing that ever leads me to say that the term azwaj refers to females or women or wives. There's just not what the Quran uses at all. 29. Qawm Lut decided to ignore what their own zawj, Lut as a zawj, yes, Lut as an akh was a zawj to his people. He was one of power. He was there to offer help. He assisted his people where they fell short. He was somebody that they relied upon. He was their zawj. Qawm Lut decided to ignore what their own zawj, Lut, offered them and preferred the reminder from other societies. Number 30. The powerful people of Rasul Lut were already banishing people who objected to them. Certain, just as we saw in the translation of the ayah. 31. There is no mention of any shahwa in the first conversation recorded in the Quran between Lut and his community. Isn't that interesting? Unless one chooses to see sex everywhere in the Quran, there isn't any, and especially not in this scene. Rasul Lut, number 32. Rasul Lut expressed his displeasure at the direction his community was taking. 33. The community had not yet become a qarya with no hope of return. 34. Rasul Lut did not talk of any homosexual activity being done in his society in this particular section. Now what I'd like to do is to look at some interesting terms in a bit of a greater detail. And maybe as part of that, try and answer some of the questions that might be ones that you want to ask. A couple of reminders. There are some terms that you would have heard us mention that have been covered in the previous video. For example, qawm, why this is males and females, we talked about that. Akh, we talked about that. Alameen, why we take alameen to be domains of knowledge, places formed of knowledge, etc. We talked about that. So if you are interested, I would encourage you to go to the first video and watch those once more. Inni lakum rasulun mubin is a refrain used by the Quran about 6 times. Fattaqullah wa ati'un, again, is something that the Quran uses quite a few times. This ta'a, by the way, is to lead the follower to the message that's being preached. It's never a prophet or a messenger saying that you have to follow me, my whims and desires. But whenever this ta'a is being talked about, this is through the messenger to the message itself. So in essence, what the person is always being led towards is to the message of Allah. Again, this term appears quite a few times in the Quran as well. For those who are interested, there's some very interesting avenues of research that these connections open up. Now let's look at this particular word that appears in these ayat, which has been translated quite weirdly. Somehow it's become associated with sexual connotations. That when there's ityan happening, when there's somebody coming to somebody, then it is coming with an intention of wanting sex, and homosexual sex to be precise. That is not the case at all. There's nothing sexual about this at all in the Quran. Ityan, whenever it's mentioned in the Quran, it's about the approach, dawn of abstract objects, principles, ideas, orders. And what I've done is I've got a few examples for those who are interested in going and cross-referencing this for themselves. هَلْ يَنْظُرُونَ إِلَّا أَنْ يَأْتِيَهُمُ اللَّهُ يَأْتِيَهُمُ اللَّهُ comes, arrives Allah. There's nothing sexual about that. Astaghfirullah. There's nothing at all. No way anybody to say there's anything but the dawn of Allah's order, of Allah's command. If we continue, فَعْفُوا وَاصْفَحُوا حَتَّى يَأْتِيَ اللَّهُ بِأَمْرِهِ comes, arrives Allah with His order, with His decision. يَوْمَ يُنْفَخُ فِي الصُّورِ فَتَأْتُونَ أَفْوَاجًا, the period when the sur is nafkh, and you come in droves. فَتَأْتُونَ أَفْوَاجًا, you come out in droves. أَفَتَأْتُونَ السِّحْرَ وَأَنْتُمْ تُبْصِرُونَ, will you take to sihr? Did you find anything sexual in there? No, because there isn't any. There isn't anywhere in the Quran where we find ityan being linked with a sexual activity. It's not there unless you want to force the matter. Let's look at zukran. Now, zukran is on the wazn of fu'lan. There are few other words in the Quran that come from the same wazn. Qurban, Furqan, Ghufran, Sultan, etc. Now, not a single time does this form of this wazn, fu'lan, change the meaning away from its root. Ghafara, when it becomes ghufran, does not suddenly mean something completely different. Not one time does the word created by the wazn reflect the noun's plural. It never becomes a plural. Qurban, furqan, ghufran, sultan. We're not talking about multiple instances at all, ever. It's always the one thing that's being referred to. Zukran, then, is a single noun derived from dhikr, which is remembrance, making prominent. Dhakar, by the way, from dhikr is also one who is favored or has information and prestige over the untha. It is not necessarily a man, and this is not necessarily a female. For those who are interested, I've covered this in a great detail in the Urdu series Quran and Aurat. What is Dhukran then? It's a reminder, warning, instruction that is kept, made prominent. Also, I've got a reminder here to talk to you about this once more. In this section, at the very least, there was no talk of shahwa. We'll find this word coming up later. But in this particular section, the first time this conversation happens, there's no shahwa being talked about. Azwaj? No, azwaj are not wives. They are partners. They are those who are on a similar mission, those who help meet a certain requirement. Did you wonder why there was no zawjat in the Quran? Quran never says this person had a zawja, zawjatun. Never says you have zawjat, you have female partners. Never says. It's always azwaj. Azwaj or zawj is not a female person. Azwaj can be replaced if and when they're required per the changing requirements of the project. The interest may not be there from the azwaj, for example. And also, interestingly, azwaj in the Quran does not mean two. وَكُنْتُمْ أَزْوَاجًا ثَلَاثًا. And you were three azwaj, groups, classes, partners. اُحْشُرُوا الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا وَأَزْوَاجَهُمْ وَمَا كَانُوا يَعْبُدُونَ. If we were to insist that azwaj in the Quran means wives, so it means wives in the section we just read, and it means wives throughout the Quran, well, what you're really saying is that Allah is going to punish those who did dhulm and their wives. What had their wives done? Why is their wives going to bear the burden of what their husbands did? That is not fair. That is not Allah. احشروا الذين ظلموا وأزواجهم وما كانوا يعبدون. Gather, stuff those who did wrong and their mates, their partners, their associates. That is what the Quran is talking about. Alright, so we've covered this section. And before I move on, no sex in there whatsoever. Al-Dhukran, as is alleged, أَتَأْتُونَ ذُكْرَانًا مِنَ الْعَالَمِينَ, does not mean that you approach men of the world. وَتَذَرُونَ مَا خَلَقَ لَكُمْ رَبُّكُمْ مِنْ أَزْوَاجِكُمْ. It does not mean that you leave behind your wives that you did marry for some weird reason, but you still go on and talk just about the men. You go and do all this sort of stuff with men whilst you're leaving behind the women. It is not what is being talked about here at all. Let's continue. Here is the second time Rasul Lut has a talk with his community, but this time he's no longer an akh. And so you will see that the nature of the talk changes as well. Before I continue, I'll take out some of these highlights. I did them last time because we ignored them, but I'll take out the highlights because otherwise I think it'll be a bit too distracting. Right, that is done. I am going to now, just like we did last time, zoom in and we will go ayah by ayah, word by word of these three times this conversation happens, and basically show you that the Quran has nothing to talk about homosexuality in these sections. We will start by looking at Ayat 28 to 30 of chapter 29. وَلُوطًا إِذْ قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ إِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ الْفَاحِشَةَ مَا سَبَقَكُمْ بِهَا مِنْ أَحَدٍ مِنَ الْعَالَمِينَ. And Lut, when he said to his qawm, those in his proximity remit, males and females. Remember what we just said before. So, and Lut, when he said to his qawm, men and women, surely you all approach the fahisha, excessiveness in being wrong, at a level that no one in the alameen, those around you, has reached. أَإِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ الرِّجَالِ وَتَقْطَعُونَ السَّبِيلَ وَتَأْتُونَ فِي نَادِيكُمْ الْمُنْكَرِ. Do you all, males and females, approach the powerful, authoritative ones, rijal, and cut off the as-sabil, Allah's path, and you approach in your gatherings that which is understood to be wrong is disavowed. فَمَا كَانَ جَوَابَ قَوْمِهِ إِلَّا أَنْ قَالَ ائْتِنَا بِعَذَابِ اللَّهِ إِن كُنْتَ مِنَ الصَّادِقِينَ. Then the only answer his qawm had was this: bring to us the adhab, retribution of Allah, Allah's rules, if you are indeed from the truthful ones. قال رَبِّ انصُرْنِي عَلَى الْقَوْمِ الْمُفْسِدِينَ. He said, my Rabb Nourisher, help me against the qawm of the mufsideen, corruptors, breakers of Allah's rules, the deen. Let's continue on and look at the second time we find a similar conversation between Lut and his people. Now this is Ayat 80 to 82 of chapter 7. وَلُوطًا إِذْ قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ أَتَأْتُونَ الْفَاحِشَةَ مَا سَبَقَكُمْ بِهَا مِنْ أَحَدٍ مِنَ الْعَالَمِينَ. And Lut, when he said to his qawm, those in his proximity, males and females, surely you all approach the fahisha, excessiveness in being wrong, at a level that no one in the alameen, those around you, has reached. إِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ الرِّجَالَ شَهْوَةً مِنْ دُونِ النِّسَاءِ بَلْ أَنْتُمْ قَوْمٌ مُسْرِفُونَ. Do you all, males and females, do you all approach the powerful, authoritative ones, rijal, in a state of always seeking, always wanting, always desiring more, without taking the nisa, the forgotten ones, those mutaakhirin whose potential is still to come, ones who are weak, into account? No, you all are a people, qawm, who are transgressors, excessive. وَمَا كَانَ جَوَابَ قَوْمِهِ إِلَّا أَنْ قَالُوا أَخْرِجُوهُمْ مِنْ قَرْيَتِكُمْ إِنَّهُمْ أُنَاسٌ يَتَطَهَّرُونَ. Then the only answer his qawm had was this: kick them out from your qarya. Your qarya equals hollow group, echo chamber. They are surely a specific people who like to cleanse the mental, spiritual filth. Now let's look at the last time this conversation happens, and this is between the ayats 54 to 56 of chapter 27. وَلُوطًا إِذْ قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ أَتَأْتُونَ الْفَاحِشَةَ وَأَنْتُمْ تُبْصِرُونَ. And Lut, when he said to his qawm, those in his proximity, surely you all, males and females, approach this fahisha, excessiveness in being wrong, and you realize that. أَإِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ الرِّجَالَ شَهْوَةً مِنْ دُونِ النِّسَاءِ بَلْ أَنْتُمْ قَوْمٌ تَجْهَلُونَ. Do you all, males and females, do you all approach the powerful, authoritative ones, rijal, in a state of always seeking, wanting, desiring more, without taking the forgotten ones, the weak ones into account? No, you all are a people, qawm, who choose to ignore, overlook, not consider. فَمَا كَانَ جَوَابَ قَوْمِهِ إِلَّا أَنْ قَالُوا أَخْرِجُوا آلَ لُوطٍ مِنْ قَرْيَتِكُمْ إِنَّهُمْ أُنَاسٌ يَتَطَهَّرُونَ. Then the only answer his qawm had was this: kick al Lut out from your qarya. They are surely a specific people who like to cleanse the mental, spiritual filth. Let's look at the propositions of this section, and then we'll have a talk about some of the very interesting terms that we covered as we were going through the mafhum/translation of these ayat word by word. Our context, just as a reminder, now this is the time where the Medina has started becoming a qarya. When Lut is talking to his people now, the tone of the conversation is different. We talked about this in great detail in the first video. It's no longer an akh, and he doesn't have the same power, the same command he had before. So the way he talks and the responses he gets, they are completely different. Also, what's interesting is that even though we got these three sections that look very similar superficially, there are actually two slightly different conversations that are happening, despite the familiarity of the wordings in there. But for now, I've put them together just to get the main point of today's video out. What is the main point? What is the main talking points of Lut in this particular new world for him? You all, men and women, have become the worst group among all the others around you. You, men and women, only curry favor with the rich and powerful at the expense of the forgotten ones, the weaker ones of your society. You are now approaching all things unknown wrong in your private gatherings, and you are willfully, knowingly ignoring the consequences of your decisions. Now in return, when the people, his people who no longer fear him, they reply to him, Lut, hasten this azab that you say is going to come. But at the same time, these people acknowledged that Lut and those around him, not just his two daughters, but those people who worked with him, were focused on a mission to fix the worldview of their people. A major decision happens at this particular point where they decide to kick out al-Lut from the qarya, not the ahl-Lut, the al-Lut. This is the key takeaway, the key thing that happens when Lut has given his warnings. Let's look at the propositions in great detail. Number 50, Rasul Lut was already warning his qawm before the Rasul came as an akh. 51, Rasul Lut warned his qawm that comprised men and women. I'm repeating this because this bears repetition. Our qawm is men and women. For anybody who continues to insist that all of these ayat, when they mention qawm, it only talks about men, they are doing a great disservice to how the Quran talks to humanity. Quran and Allah, they talk to the aql, the nafs of bashar, nafs of insan. Insan is not men, insan is not woman. The aql, the faham, the qalb, that's not a male or a female thing either. It talks to the consciousness of a person. So whenever Allah talks, He does not ignore half of those who He has created and given this message for. We do not ignore women when we talk about humanity in the Quran. Qawm is men and women. This is such an easy thing, yet such a hard thing to get through because of the corrupt programming that has been done to us ever since we started reading the Quran and understanding it through this broken prism that has got nothing to do with the Quran. Anyway, we'll continue. 52. Lut's conversations as an akh were in a different time period than when he approached them about this fahisha. Very likely, considering the overall flow of his qissa. 53. Qata' as-sabil is to halt, interrupt, cut off the pathway of Allah and His system. And again, we've got a few notes for these terms to the right as well. 54. Rijal in the Quran are those people, associations, men and women who are self-sufficient and are relied upon. We'll talk about this on the right because I know this is a very important topic. Similarly, number 55, nisa in the Quran are those people, things, associations that have been left behind. Their potential is still to come, the forgotten ones. We'll talk about this on the right as well. 56. The qawm had started approaching the discouraged, unrecognized, most corrupt ways to further serve the cause of the powerful ones of this society. 57. Rasul Lut's qawm had become more excessive in their wrong deeds than any of the surrounding community because they had taken the zukran from them and exceeded even them. 58. Rasul Lut's qawm approached, beseeched, took care of the powerful ones of this society only, seeking, wanting even more, whilst ignoring the weaker components of the society at the expense of the nisa. 59. Rasul Lut's qawm cut off the path of Allah's rules, in particular the looking after of the nisa, the weak ones of the society. 60. Rasul Lut's qawm challenged Lut to hasten this adhab, this punishment. 61. In 782, the qawm appeals to someone else to get Lut and his followers expelled from their qaryah, not the qaryah of the qawm, someone else's qaryah. So the qawm is asking somebody else who is in a qaryah to kick Lut out of their qaryah, not the qaryah of the qawm. Now this is a key reason why I say the conversations on the right that we just read are happening at two different occasions. Because in the second conversation they say, أَخْرِجُوهُمْ مِنْ قَرْيَتِكُمْ. So they are asking someone else to kick them out, them being Lut and those with him, from your qaryah, not from our qaryah. They're not saying take them out from our society. No, you take them out from your qaryah. And what we find in the other ayah is instead something different. قَالُ اُعْتِنَا بِعَذَابِ اللَّهِ. They said, come to us with the punishment of Allah. So in this particular instance, the conversation they're driving towards themselves. They are including themselves. But in this particular part, they are taking this conversation away from them and asking someone else to do something to the al of Lut. 62. Conversation between Lut and his qawm in chapter 29 are at a different time than in chapter 7 and 27. Also, there's one more reason which makes me think that is what indeed happened. Because if we find innakum and shahwa, these two are not used in all of those sections. So again, it's reflecting the change of mood. Things are escalating when Lut is talking. From being an akh to the second time he talks and the third time he talks, there's an escalation of what his qawm has begun to do. 63. The qawm willingly and knowingly ignored the consequences of their actions, which is Allah's sunnah for zalim qaryas, even when they knew it fully well. Tajhalun while tubsirun. We'll talk about this. 64. At this point, Rasul Lut's qawm had started their descent into a qaryah from a qawm that lived in a Medina by doing fasad, corruption of Allah's rules. 65. Rasul Lut's qawm had become excessive in their wrongs without caring to fix what they had broken, musrifun. 66. Rasul Lut asked Allah for help against only those who were mufsideen, al-qawm al-mufsideen, not the whole qawm that he belonged to. 67. Rasul Lut already had people devoted to his mission when he challenged his qawm. 68. The qawm asked for the kicking out of Rasul Lut and his al from the qaryah of like-minded individuals. 69. The powerful ones of the society did not know who the ahl of Lut were, and so they could only punish the more obvious followers, the al. 70. The qawm of Rasul Lut acknowledged that he and his followers were trying to cleanse the mental spiritual filth. 71. Even when his al is saved, which is something we covered in the first video, Lut stayed behind with his ahl. 72. Considering Rasul Lut's fear when the messengers visited him, his decision to stay on, and the open threats to his al, his manner of resistance with his ahl had to change. Now I'm calling this to be very likely, because you've got a messenger who has been on a mission for quite a long time. The stakes have risen, things have changed, his al has been kicked out, he is left with his ahl. He really could not operate the way he was operating before. 73. Lut's fight. I will want you to pay very close attention to this proposition. Lut's fight, his mission, was against the class system of his society, where the nisa, the weak forgotten ones, were ignored, exploited on purpose. 74. Per the Quran, Lut's qawm were not challenged by Rasul Lut for doing acts of homosexuality. 75. In these scenes, we have not encountered any mention of any sex being done by anyone with anyone. 76. Lut's qawm was not punished because of their alleged homosexual conduct. They were punished, but not for this. Now, there were a few terms that we talked about in passing. I'd like to have a more detailed discussion about them, to try and preempt some of the questions that you might have, and to get you started thinking on these lines, if you haven't had the chance to before. First, fahish or fahisha. Fahish in the Quran, doing things out of natural inclinations excessively and spreading them with the intent of harming others. Fahisha, opposite of zalamu anfusahum, that is doing excessive wrong to others. I've got an example here. وَالَّذِينَ إِذَا فَعَلُوا فَاحِشَةً أَوْ ظَلَمُوا أَنفُسَهُمْ ذَكَرُوا اللَّهَ. Now in this ayah below that we'll talk about, people are not complaining about their forefathers watching pornography or engaging in orgies or things to do with sex, but because these people, their aba'ahum, were doing actions that were patently wrong, and they continue to spread them. وَإِذَا فَعَلُوا فَاحِشَةً, and when they do fahisha, قالوا, they said, وَجَدْنَا عَلَيْهَا آبَاءَنَا, we found upon these things our forefathers, our thought leaders as well. It's not sexual stuff that is being talked about. This is not at all what the Quran is mentioning. We have to take off this obsession to find sex everywhere in the Quran. It doesn't exist. Quran doesn't talk about that. Let me repeat one more time. It's talking to the aql of the bashar, of the insan. It is not talking about how or what not to do when you have sex. It is not the purpose of the Quran. Just to round this out, I've taken another form of fahish, another derivative of it, fahsha, to also show even that's got nothing to do with things that are sexual in nature. It's just not. إِنَّمَا يَأْمُرُكُمْ بِالسُّوءِ وَالْفَحْشَاءِ. And he orders you with su and fahsha, things that are bad, things that are wrong. And this is the ayah that we covered in the Salah series, in which we said and looked at what the Quranic Salah is versus the practice, the ritual practice that we see in our life all around us. Quranic Salah, positive two-way connections. When you do that, that stops the spread of excessive harm against others. Not the going up and down 5 times a day, but the Quranic Salah, which is a positive formation of connections that strengthen the bonds within a society, they make it better. And that is in that context when you read this ayah, إِنَّ الصَّلَاةَ تَنْهَى عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ وَالْمُنْكَرِ, that the salah of the Quran, when you have a society in which things are positively being reforged and strengthened all the time, that stops excessive harm. Tanha anil fahisha, that is what stops the excessive harm. No pornography here either. Just because you go and stand and join others 5 times a day, going up and down in this ritualistic manner, it does not stop you either from watching pornography, and it also does not make all of this wrong in a society go away. Nothing like that happens. So just to recap, fahish and all of its derivatives, the ones that I looked at anyway, they're not linked to sex, pornography, sodomy, homosexuality, anything like that. As-sabil. As-sabil is Allah's path. It is not also, by the way, the physical highway, motorway, freeway, interstate that runs between cities. So some people have translated this to say, oh, these people were bandits. They were robbing people, doing all that sort of stuff. No. وَإِنَّهُمْ يَصُدُّونَهُمْ عَنِ السَّبِيلِ. And they block them from the way, the path of Allah. وَيَحْسَبُونَ أَنَّهُمْ مُهْتَدُونَ. And they think that they are the ones seeking guidance. وَعَلَى اللَّهِ قَصْدُ السَّبِيلِ. And it is upon Allah to show the way, the path. As-sabil in the Quran is Allah's sabil. It is not the road. It is not the motorway. It is nothing like that. I've got a few more examples that I'll leave you to read if you are interested. وَهُوَ يَهْدِي السَّبِيلِ, for example, فَصَدَّهُمْ عَنِ السَّبِيلِ. قَطَعَ in the Quran is used in the ma'nawi sense. It is to sever in a metaphorical sense. الَّذِينَ يَنْقُضُونَ أَحْدَ اللَّهِ مِنْ بَعْدِ مِيثَاقِهِ وَيَقْطَعُونَ مَا أَمَرَ اللَّهُ بِهِ. They unjoin, cut away, sever what Allah ordered. وَيَقْطَعُونَ مَا أَمَرَ اللَّهُ بِهِ أَنْ يُوصَلْ. Also, there's no, as a side note, Quran does not talk about severing hands of thieves. Allah was not this inept theologian who couldn't even tell us when to apply this punishment, that is of cutting of hands, and when not to. Does it only apply for those who steal $1 million? Or does it also apply to that child who steals a candy from the supermarket? Allah did not leave all of that to us to figure out, to plug in the gaps that his broken theology left for us. There's no severing of hands at all. That ayah I've covered in great detail in an Urdu video for those who haven't watched it. But in short, فَقْطَعُوا أَيْدِيَهُمَا, cut off their support networks. So again, qata'a throughout the Quran is being used in that ma'nawi sense. You can't take it any other way. So qata'a as-sabil is not men stopping caravans on the Silk Route and robbing and looting them, but it is them stopping others from walking the right path, the path where societies, if they were to walk, become prosperous. Shahwa. You're going to tell me, no matter what you say, shahwa, there's no way to take it anywhere else except for the desire of having sex with somebody from either the same gender or from a different gender. No, you'll be surprised, but in the Quran, every single place that I looked does not use shahwa in a sexual sense at all. What is shahwa? It is the act of a conscious, aqil, human, man or woman, again, don't forget the woman, to desire something. For example, latest models of smartphones, success, fame, etc. It's a taste that's acquired through the agency of a free, sane agent. To restrain it to sex, and that too for men only, what does it reflect? It reflects the translator's mind frame and not the Quranic mafhum. Let's read a couple of the Quranic ayat to get this point absolutely clear, that has got nothing to do with sex. نحن أولياؤكم في الحياة الدنيا وفي الآخرة ولكم فيها ما تشتهي أنفسكم. Whatever yourselves desire, ولكم, and for you all, فيها, in there, ما تشتهي أنفسكم, whatever yourselves desire, require, want, wish for, whatever. Why take it and stop it just at sex all the time? Don't people think more than that? So, reminder, shahwa is for nas, it's not just for men. Allah is not forgetting the women. And when we remember that and we read an ayah like this, زُجِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ حُبُّ الشَّهَوَاتِ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ, it's not saying that an-nas here is just men and all they want is sex from the women. Astaghfirullah. An-nas is men and women. Again, it's like qawm. Can't forget the women in the Quran. You just can't do that. Made available, appealing for humanity, an-nas. the desire for nisa, new things, things that are yet to come. Let's continue. Rijal. No, rijal is not men in the Quran anyway. Rijal in the Quran are women and men, associations, governments, etc., who are in power, have authority in a specific domain. They are self-sufficient, can be dependent upon, relied upon. They are the agents of change. To give you an analogy, a content producer who sways public opinion, those men and women are the rijal of YouTube. Quran doesn't talk to the gender, talks to the nafs, the aql. And if you look at some of the ayat, this thing becomes patently clear. وَبَيْنَهُمَا حِجَابٌ وَعَلَى الْأَعْرَافِ رِجَالٌ يَعْرِفُونَ كُلًّا بِسِيمَاهُمْ. And on the heights, a'raf, people, women and men with agency who know. لَا تَقُمْ فِيهِ أَبَدًا لَمَسْجِدٌ أُسِّسَ عَلَى التَّقْوَى مِنْ أَوَّلِ يَوْمٍ أَحَقُّ أَنْ تَقُومَ فِيهِ رِجَالٌ يُحِبُّونَ أَنْ يَتَطَهَّرُوا وَاللَّهُ يُحِبُّ الْمُطَّهِّرِينَ. And do not be a part of it ever. A place of action founded upon Allah consciousness from the first day is worthy of you being a part of it. In it are people who love to purify. فِيهِ رِجَالٌ يُحِبُّونَ أَنْ يَتَطَهَّرُوا. Allah loves those who purify themselves. By the way, this ayah not only destroys the concept of a traditional masjid as we understand, it also makes you think, where did they even come with the term of this wudu, and reconcile this with this Quranic ayah? Because this ayah is saying that people are in the masjid, and they are in the masjid because they love to wash themselves. If I take the normal translations that they enforce on us. Normally when you enter the masjid, you wash yourself through this ritual wudu before you enter the masjid. Here the ayah is saying, in that masjid are those who love to purify, love to cleanse. You cleanse and then you enter today's masjid. In the Quranic masjid, you enter the masjid to cleanse yourselves and others around you. That is the masjid of the Quran. And that is the rijal of the Quran. Those who are doing this particular action, not men. If we continue, rijalun la tulhihim tijara, and men and women of agency. So recap, rijal of the Quran is not men that we find today in today's Fusha Arabic, or even in the Banu Abbas's canonical books of this fiqh, madhab Islam that they have made up. It's got nothing to do with that. Nisa, men and women associations, governments, whose potential is still to come. They are mutaakhirin, those old young who have been left behind, even things that are yet to come in the future. So this is the ayah we just covered up above. زُيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ حُبُّ الشَّهَوَاتِ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ, made appealing for humanity the desire for new things. That is a universal reality. We all know. That is what the Quran talks about. The wudu ayah, this very famous wudu ayah, talks nothing about wudu. And for those interested, we talked about this ayah in detail in the Salat in the Quran series. But if I just take this little portion, أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءِ, the conversation starts with يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, men and women. And here we are being told أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءِ means that when you have sexually touched a woman. In other words, amanu, which includes men and women, now have women that are also touching women from a sexual nature. No, that is not what the Quran says. That is not the absurdity we will find ourselves if we don't stick to the meanings that have been imposed on us. An-nisa, things that are yet to come, things that are of diversional nature, things that aren't there yet. أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءِ, or you have been involved in seeking diversionary things, things that are to come, things that become your weaknesses from that particular perspective. Min dun nisa then is ignoring the interests of those who have been left behind, and that is what the qawm of Lut were doing. Yatatahharun, nothing about washing, is cleansing the minds, ridding the nonsensical and all the rubbish that corrupts the society, that paralyzes progress really. And this ayah that we just talked about, I've mentioned it in there once more because we find this term being talked about there as well. Israf in the Quran is excessively forcing people, society, standards through incorrect application of effort and not fixing where one breaks through the process. I've got an example in there. وَلَا تُطِيعُوا أَمْرَ الْمُسْرِفِينَ الَّذِينَ يُفْسِدُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَلَا يُصْلِحُونَ. So there are two characteristics that we have been given of the Musrifin. They do fasad, they corrupt the ard, and they do not fix what they break. For those who watched the first video, I talked about this qaryah in Surah Yasin, and I said why I think this could be the qaryah of Rasul Lut that's being talked about, where Musa's people also entered. And one more reason that I think the two might be related is because Bal antum qawmun musrifun is the same descriptor that Rasul Lut gave to his people as well in the Quran. Tubsirun, not paying attention. I've got a couple of ayats in there. So people who are ignoring the obvious are the ones who are not yubsirun. وَلَهُمْ أَعْيُنٌ لَا يُبْصِرُونَ بِهَا. So again, the idea that I'm establishing in here for us to be very clear about is there's no watching, there's no orgies, there's no parties, there's no men organizing these homosexual raids. It's not World of Warcraft where they're gathering 20, 30 men together and plotting out these raids and all of them are going out at the same time. No, there's nothing like that in the Quran whatsoever. Yajhalun, that was a very interesting one because Rasul Lut blamed his people. He challenged them by saying that you are willingly choosing to remain ignorant. So it's the act of those who will to become or remain ignorant. They're not those who can't grasp something, but they are ones who overlook even when it was obvious to them. وَلَكِنْ أَكْثَرَهُمْ يَجْهَلُونَ. When this happens, most of them choose to ignore. Fasid is the opposite of salih, one who fixes, restores, reconnects. So a fasid is one who does the opposite. So when Allah says, وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ الْمُفْسِدَ مِنَ الْمُصْلِحِ, Allah knows, differentiates between the mufsid, one who breaks, severs, destroys, and the muslih, one who restores, fixes, reconnects. And I've got one more ayah in there as well, if you want to go have a look at that as well. Right, in this section that contained 3 different sections of ayat from 3 different chapters, no talk of sex at all, no homosexuality, no Rasul of Allah challenging his people to stop doing homosexual acts. That is not what happened. We're almost at the end, but before I wrap up, I'd like to cover 2 more sections, very short sections, where the term Banat comes, to show that that is not what they told us is being talked about in there. So we're going to continue until we get to those parts, and I will keep these highlighted, so if you watch the first video, you'll be able to quickly, easily identify which are the parts we're talking about in this section. So to set the scene, hostilities now break out between the 2 sides. Lut has been banished, and that is why the people of that Medina come and they celebrate. The Al is gone and Lut is no longer an akh, he no longer has any power. This is the first time Rasul Lut offers his Banat to his qawm, his people. Banat, his ideas around the protection of the weaker people of the society. He did that for the first time openly in here. The first time. Once more, this happened 2 times. Now let's look at the ayat to understand how this offer from him to give his Banat came about. Now this is when they came to him and they said something to him, and he responded to them by offering his Banat. Qalu, they said, أَوَلَمْ نَنْهَكَ عَنِ الْعَالَمِينَ. They said, didn't we stop you from the others, the other communities? قال هؤلاء بناتي إن كنتم فاعلين. He said, these are my banati, ideals around the protection of the rights of the nisa. Why do I say that? Because Banat is from Banaya, building, framework, foundation. Banatu Rasul Lut are the teachings, functions, ideas that Rasul Lut had built regarding the nisa and his community who were ignored. How do we know that? Because this is exactly what we've been seeing from the very beginning of this qissa. At least at 2 different occasions, if not 2.5, he has argued with his people to do the right thing. He's explicitly called out the way they don't look after the nisa and how he is one of those rejectors who doesn't like this practice. Instead, he offers his own views, he offers his own alternatives. He is the zawj who offers a dhikr that is overlooked in the interest of the zukran that they take from those corrupt communities around them. So they are not taking the banat of this Rasul of Allah, and instead they're choosing the zukran from the corrupt societies of the world. For those who are interested in this term, again, I've got a couple of examples that we even in today's Fusha use. هَذَا مِن بَنَاتِ أَفْكَارِهِ. So whatever he has got in his mind, things that he has made up of. مِن تَصَوُّرِهِ الْخَاص مِن إِنْتَاجِهِ. So whatever he has come up with in his own, from his own perspective, in his own mind, this is his own production. This is Banat Afkar. Quickly go through and read some of the propositions that we did not do last time, and then we'll continue on at the last section and wrap up this file. Proposition number 86 is one we had skipped last time. The Quran makes no mention of the Mursalun guests as being pretty men who could be lusted over. Remember this when we come to that part of that qissa shortly. There is no talk throughout in the qissa of the Quran saying those guests, when they came, they were pretty men, or they were even men. There's no talk of that nature at all. 89. The Ahl of the Medina were not celebrating new men that they could have homosexual sex with. Why am I so certain? There's nothing sexual in the whole qissa. Not unless you force your own interpretation, your own mafhum of these terms, breaking how Quran uses those terms internally. Number 90. Rasul Lut had been stopped from engaging with outsiders. That is, whilst they took the zukran from outside, the Rasul himself was stopped. 91. For the first time in this qissa, Rasul Lut openly offers his banat, his ideals and thoughts around the protection of nisa, men and women, to the wider society. Up until now, he has not been shown to be talking to the Medina as a whole. Qawm can be a subset of people from the Medina. But this is the time he talks, he offers his banats openly, and he is rejected. Now we'll continue to the very last time he offers his banat, where he is rejected once more. And then we'll try and summarize today's conversation. So this is when the Rasul visit Rasul Lut the second time. He realizes that this is the end. The end is almost here. His qawm is no longer just doing sayyi'at, but they have gone past into a different level now. A second time he offers his banat, his ideas and thoughts around the protection of the weaker segment of the society. But once more he is rejected and without any support. So let's look at some of the interesting ayat in this section, and we'll talk about them, and then we'll try and summarize this whole conversation of today's. وجاءه قومه يهرعون إليه ومن قبل كانوا يعملون السيئات قال يا قوم هؤلاء بناتي هن أطهر لكم فاتقوا الله ولا تخزوني في ضيفي أليس منكم رجل رشيد. And his qawm, men and women, came to him hurrying, rushing towards him, and up until now they had been doing sayyi'at, bad deeds that had not yet achieved the level of kabair. He said, my qawm, these are my teachings, ideals regarding the protection of nisa. These teachings are better, purer in cleansing for you. And then he said something very interesting. Alaysa minkum rajulun rashid. Is there not among you any decent, rightful, authoritative person, man or female, left? And the reply that they gave is very interesting as well. They said, قالوا, they said, لقد علمت ما لنا في بناتك من حق وإنك لا تعلم ما نريد. They, his qawm, men and women, said, surely you Lut, you know, you have learned we have no right, requirement, desire of your banat, teachings, and you surely know what we want. Now this is when, as we talked about this in the last video, Lut is finally aware that his qawm will not change its path, that the end has arrived. So 2 times he has offered his banat. Both of the times he has been rejected. Not once did he offer his daughters. Not once did he talk about homosexual stuff that his people were doing. His mission was completely different, utterly different to what we were told in Israeliyat. So let's try and summarize this video. What did we learn from this? What did the Quran tell us? Lut's fight was against the class system of his society, where the nisa, the weak, forgotten ones, were ignored, exploited on purpose. That is what his mission was. That is the purpose we today read his qissa, in order to have not just sympathy, but take lessons from his qissa of a person, how he can plot his path of struggle against a qawm who continues to reject the looking after of the weaker people, the younger people, the older people of the community. How to deal in a society that is on its path to destruction. This is a sunnatullah. This is what we see today. Societies today that have got the same class system, they have a Lut today somewhere out there fighting the same fight as well. And that Lut, today's Lut, is just like the Quran's Lut, not offering his daughters to homosexuals, nor is he fighting the gays. Lut's fight is a much nobler one than what we made out to be. Quran's Lut, once more, for goodness sake, is not the lot of the Bible, of the Riwayat or the Israeliyat. And no, there's no homosexual stuff that his people did. And no, his qawm was not punished because of sodomy. And no, Lut was not a messenger who offered his own daughters to a bunch of homosexuals who couldn't control their hormones. And also, there is no punishment of homosexuality mentioned in the qissa of Lut. Hear me once more. Homosexuality carries no punishment in the qissa of Lut. Islam of the Quran of Nabi Muhammad did not allow flogging or burning alive or pushing off a tall building or stoning of someone who engaged in homosexuality. Allah and His Rasul are free from what has been done in their name, what has been alleged in their name. What we are seeing today being done in the name of Islam has got nothing to do with Allah, His Rasul and the Quran. Nothing whatsoever. There's also one more takeaway. I would say the scariest takeaway. As I said in the first video, Lut's story is about 1400 words long from a total of about 80,000 words in the Quran. If they messed up these 1400 words this bad, basing it off stories of the Jews and the riwayat they concocted themselves, created and populated and constantly adjusted, what else is wrong with the traditional translations? How much more careful we should be when we read translations being done by them for the remainder of the Quran. Doesn't that scare you? It scares me. Before I wrap up, you might have questions. You might have a lot of them. Let me ask you a question first. Did you listen to the Quran? Did you look at the references? You're going to come up to me and say, oh, but Fulan said this. Fulan did that. That book written by that person, comprising these Israeliyat and riwayat and these stories, they did that. That ruler did so and so. If you do anything like that, let me remind you once more, for Allah's sake, all that was presented today was Allah's word. Allah's word was presented. His kalam was presented. That should be enough. That should be enough. If not, what more words could I add on top of what Allah mentioned Himself? None. Last ayah for today. فَوَيْلٌ لِلَّذِينَ يَكْتُبُونَ الْكِتَابَ بِأَيْدِيهِمْ ثُمَّ يَقُولُونَ هَذَا مِنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ لِيَشْتَرُوا بِهِ ثَمَنًا قَلِيلًا فَوَيْلٌ لَهُمْ مِمَّا كَتَبَتْ أَيْدِيهِمْ وَوَيْلٌ لَهُمْ مِمَّا يَكْسِبُونَ. So woe to those who write the Al-Kitab law with their own hands, then say, this is from Allah, in order to exchange it for a small price. Woe to them for what their hands have written. Their hands have written. And woe to them for what they earn. Consider the Quranic evidence. Think about it. Let it sink in. Don't rush. Let the Quran continue to guide your worldview. Until the next time, Assalamu alaikum.